So I've probably already put in my bumper music and done my splash screen and poured my beer. So clearly this is a slightly different video. And indeed, it is. This is going to be a bit of a memory review of the beers that I shared with my friends on my birthday. So I kind of learned the value of friendship, like the real values of friendship, not terribly long ago. And so there's several guys in the area, mostly at the church that I attend, that I have invested in and who have invested in me. And most of them enjoy beer. Most of them don't get into beer quite so much as I do. I am definitely the beer nerd in the group. There's stories about that. But so it kind of makes sense that at my party, there would be beer. And I'm also going to be drinking a beer I have already recorded a video for, the Rite of Spring, a Rustic Honey Saison by Otherland's Beer. All of the beers that I specifically shared at that party, and I did them kind of like a show and tell session. So I had a bunch of small glasses, small tasting glasses, and I shared the beers around with those who wanted to participate and explained what it was that I was tasting and smelling. And it was kind of a fun for me, and most of the guys seem to go along with it because they know that's a part of me and something I enjoy. And it was my party, so I get to set the rules. So super awesome. Anyways, so tasting session, show and tell. The beers that I got to try with my friends were all beers I got from Packmule, and great thanks to them for having such a selection of really amazing beers. When doing a beer tasting, it's just like when doing a cheese tasting or a wine tasting, it can be helpful to stay within a certain set of parameters. So you're not taking a beer from all the way out in left field here and all the way out in right field there, or maybe that's right to y'all and left to me, whatever. And so there's no context. Instead, it can be helpful to set a context. So maybe beers from a region, so a micro region, or different beers from the same brewery, or beers within the same family. So when I wanted to share beers of my specific favorite type, that is Saison. If you've watched me for any amount of time, you know that Saisons are generally my favorite family of beers. So I wanted to share beers that were Saisons, and it's hard to find a brewery that makes, several different Saisons all at the same time. So instead of looking at maybe all beers from the same brewery, I instead found beers of the same family that came from different breweries. And the 4 beers that I got to try to share with my friends were Animal Shapes by Logan Brewing Company out of Burien, Washington. The Saison de Lis by Perennial Artisan Ale out of St. Louis. Sakura, which was a Saison by Burke-Gilman Brewing Company out of Seattle. And Ralph by the Ale Apothecary. And they were very different beers. I still have a can of Animal Shapes, so I am going to do a standalone review of that. And perhaps that's for the best, because by comparison, that was the simplest beer of the lot. And simple isn't bad. And I think on its own, that beer stands up a lot better than it did in that illustrious company. So the Saison de Lis out of Perennial Artisan Ale out of St. Louis, that's a beer, a Saison aged on chamomile flowers, which was beautiful. It's floral, and it was just really, really beautiful, really nice. That review you can go watch. I've already done a full review before I actually had my party on that one, and so I'm not going to spend very much time on that. And then Animal Shapes. But the 2 beers that came in bottles, the 2 special beers, were Sakura and Ralph. And Sakura means cherry blossom in Japanese. The story that was told me by the Packmule dude is that Burke-Gilman Brewing Company had made a Saison, and it was good, but they didn't sell it all. And so they were thinking, hey, we got this beer in a barrel. What are we going to do with it? And what they did is they added a bunch of cherry blossoms to it and aged it for another period of time. Their actual notes on their website say that they aged it on these cherry blossoms for a month. And then I think they did something else with it afterwards. But I think that was basically the gist of it, is they put the beer back through a relatively short aging process on cherry blossoms. And the result was beautiful. It was already a dry floral beer. Aging it dries it out more, and it wasn't particularly tart, which I appreciated because the cherry blossoms themselves, I don't know if you've been around a cherry tree in the spring when it's blossoming, they are just so profuse. They are beautiful. I'm sure you've seen pictures of, it's a real popular thing in Japan to go see the Sakura. Washington, D.C. has a ton of cherry trees around the lake there, and even here in Washington State around the Capitol, there are several cherry trees. And the aroma is just, it's really special. It's really beautiful. And this beer had that in spades. It was not the most unique beer amongst this selection. That distinction lies with Ralph, and I'll get to Ralph. But it was really beautiful, and it was well made. And because of the quality of the flavors in it, and also because it was, in its lack of weirdness, it was far more drinkable and sessionable than the even more special Ralph. So Sakura kind of won my vote as my favorite, the one I definitely want to drink again, and it still has that. But then the really special beer. So I've heard the name the Ale Apothecary for some time. It is one of several amazing world standard breweries out of Bend, Oregon. And Ralph is not a Saison per se, but it is a wild ale, and all Saisons are wild ales, though not all wild ales are Saisons. And Ralph does specifically note they are an American wild ale, so they don't claim to be a Saison. But it's in the same family, right? So when I was meeting up with Packmule and I saw this Ale Apothecary beer, that made me very excited. And the beer, well, it was something else. It was different from any other beer I've ever had. Pouring it into my glass, I was first worried because all of a sudden I felt as though I had fur sap all over my fingers, and I didn't. It was just the beer. So this is the description of the beer. It is a wild ale that is brewed with fir needles and then open fermented and then barrel aged in Pinot Noir barrels and then infused with more fir needles and then conditioned with wildflower honey, as one does, right? The aroma of this beer was like you were walking through a fir forest. And I have fir trees all over my property. It's the most prolific of the evergreens on my property. And that sap that drops, it gets on your hand, and then you're smelling it for the next several hours until that really sticky sap goes away, or you finally wash it off, or more often than not, I'll get the metal scrubber to scrub it off because I want to smell something besides fir sap. But it's a nice smell, if you're not trying to smell something else. So that was really the thing that stuck into my mind. It had this beautiful, strong, pungent fir aroma. And that stood in stark contrast to, for instance, the spruce beer I had, the spruce tip beer I had from Fort George, where I was expecting a pine tree kind of aroma and flavor, but it wasn't. It was oddly sweet. And that's when I learned, well, because that's what the spruce tips smell like and taste like. They don't add a whole lot of pine tree aroma to the beer. This one had the pine tree in spades. And I think my appreciation for gins, like London dry gins with their strong juniper aromas, that kind of helped me enjoy it. The general consensus was that it was a very unique, special, and weird beer that was really, really, really tasty. It was well crafted. but maybe a bit too weird to be sessionable, right? I would enjoy a 6-ounce pour of that a lot of the time. And then I would move on to a different beer. I would probably do that one if I were like at a tap room and I was going through a session. I'd probably start with something lighter than that. I'd use that in the middle, and then I'd have to find some kind of wild stout to finish out if I were planning a rising, a vertical tasting. But it was such a unique and special beer. Even the honey could be picked out. It wasn't overwhelming just fur. I know I've harped on that, but that's also the thing that stands out in my mind a month later. It was the fur. But the honey was still playing a role there. It was quite tart. Being an open fermented beer means that they actually open. That's different from. So, kind of definitions here. Most saisons these days are specifically treated with a wild yeast, a yeast that is wild. I'm not sure what the legal definition is between a tame or domesticated yeast and a wild yeast, but you can make wild beers without having to actually open your fermenting casks up to the open air. But if the beer says it's open fermented, I'm pretty sure that means you are dealing with them actually opening the beer, the pre-beer, up to the open air in order to pick up the yeasts and other microorganisms that are in the vicinity. So a lot of very great historic breweries do this, and they've been doing it inside the same buildings for hundreds of years. And so they aren't necessarily picking up just the yeast that came in on a whim from somewhere. There are actually colonies of yeasts living in the building that they have taken time to actually care for and develop over these hundreds of years, right? With a younger brewery like the Ale Apothecary, I don't know how old they are. I'm guessing they've been around a couple decades maybe. They don't have those hundreds of years of history, so there is a bit more of a risk doing that. However, yeasts are also kind of geographically bound, like you're going to find particular yeast in particular areas. Going to, say, Double Mountain Brewing, they harvested their house yeast originally from the slopes of Mount Hood, I believe it was. So they actually got a wild yeast and then have developed it and tamed it, per se. So the Ale Apothecary actually opened up their troughs, let the wild yeast in the air come in. And those wild yeast tend to produce more tart, more lactic acid, more sour beers. But balanced with this fir, just this double hit of fir, both the aroma and the taste with the honey, it was just such a special beer. Really, really beautiful beer. If you get a chance to try that and you like weird, funky beers, that's right up there with the best I've had. Super awesome. So in order to place the beers, the 4 beers that I tried in an order of I'm not even going to say best to worst or worst to best, because none of them were bad. Some of them were just more common. And a good common beer is a great beer, and one I'm more likely to drink more often than a great weird beer, right? But there is still a hierarchy. And if I'm going to place a hierarchy, it's going to be that Animal Shapes was at the bottom. And like I said, not because it's a bad beer, just because it was less interesting than all the other beers that I was drinking. Then Saison de Lis was second up. And that was because it added to the foundation of a good Saison with this extra kind of chamomile character that was identifiable. And that really helped people who weren't as experienced with weird beers to see, oh, hey, yeah, I can taste how that chamomile has played a part in the flavor of the beer. And then there was Ralph, which I am placing second place and not first place, because while it was definitely the weirder and the more interesting beer, it's not the beer I would necessarily want to drink as often again. The beer I really want to drink again, the beer that I enjoyed the most, the beer that was just hands down beautiful in all ways was Sakura by Burke-Gilman Brewing. And yeah, so that was my birthday party. Anyways, hope all y'all have a great whatever day this is, and I'll catch y'all on the flip side.